Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling something pretty fundamental, I think, to the human experience.
Hmm.
Why is it that when loss or grief or, real hardship hits, we so often find ourselves pointing fingers instead of maybe offering a hand?
Yeah, it's a tough one. We'll be digging into this complex area by looking at how society tends to react to suffering. We're drawing on some personal stories, but also observations on these broader cultural things like victim blaming, that pressure to always be positive, and even how spirituality sometimes gets used to avoid difficult feelings.
Exactly. So our mission really for this deep dive is trying to understand why we seem to default to blame instead of, empathy when we see others in pain. And what are the consequences of that? For the person suffering, obviously, but also for us, for society. Hopefully we can maybe unlock a new way of looking at these often really puzzling responses.
Right, where should we start?
Okay, let's dive in. Let's maybe start with just how weird we can be around grief and death sometimes.
Hmm. It's fascinating, isn't it? How we tend to analyze all the details around a loss, almost like we're detectives trying to solve why it happened. The sources we looked at had some pretty striking examples of this,
Yeah.
like judging someone for their lifestyle choices. Maybe they didn't exercise enough, or they went to a certain country, or were just out at a club, using those things to, explain their misfortune.
It's that powerful urge to find a reason, isn't it? Even when things happen that just seem completely random. That
Mhm.
example that really stuck with me was Matt, the guy who wasn't wearing a life jacket.
Oh, right.
The immediate judgment there, that sort of unspoken accusation that he was somehow responsible for his own death,
Yeah,
it just feels so harsh, especially given the situation.
It does, and the material suggests that when a loss feels really random or out of order, a young, seemingly healthy person dying suddenly, that can trigger even more judgment.
Why is that, do you think?
Well, it's like we just can't quite square it with our view of the world, the fragility of life, the idea that everything can change in an instant. It's terrifying, really. So we desperately look for some kind of logical flaw, something the person did to make sense of what feels senseless.
It's like we're trying to build this little mental wall, aren't we? A protective barrier against just how unpredictable life is. If we can pin it on something they did,
Yeah, a mistake they made.
then maybe we can tell ourselves, okay, I wouldn't do that, so I'm safe. Does that ring true for you? Have you ever caught yourself or seen others doing that? Trying to find blame when something awful and unexpected happens?
Oh, definitely. And if you connect that to the bigger picture, this need to find fault is, well, it's deeply tied into victim shaming, isn't it? It works almost like a psychological shield.
How so?
The thinking, often totally unconscious, is something like, okay, they must have done something foolish, something risky to end up in that situation. I wouldn't do that, therefore I'm okay. Blame becomes this really twisted way of trying to preserve ourselves.
Prioritizing our own feeling of safety over actually connecting with someone's pain.
Exactly. It's like building a wall, but it's, built on pretty shaky ground. It gives this illusion of control.
A very distorted sense of control,
Yeah.
right? Creating this story where bad things only happen to people who, in some way, deserve it. It
Yeah.
reinforces that completely false idea that if I just tick all the right boxes, follow all the rules.
Yeah, nothing bad will touch me or my family.
Right.
And, Brene Brown's research, which comes up in our source material, really sheds light on this. She talks about blame as a way to discharge our own pain and discomfort.
Okay, discharge it how?
Well, seeing someone else in deep suffering forces us to face our own vulnerability, how precarious our own lives are. And that feeling, it's deeply unsettling. Blame is like a quick release valve for that discomfort, that raw empathy we might feel initially. Blame helps us manage it, push it away.
So it's almost like an emotional knee-jerk reaction. Point the finger and boom, you create distance from that really uncomfortable truth about your own potential for pain. It's not really rational, is it? It's more primal.
Deeply wired, yeah. And this tendency, it's not just about individual incidents. What's really striking is how this need to assign blame just filters through our whole culture. It shapes how we respond to major social issues.
Absolutely. I mean, think about how society often reacts to violence against women or minority groups. How often is the first and frankly disturbing response to look for what the victim did wrong?
Yeah, what they were wearing, where they were.
Exactly. Implying their choices somehow invited the harm. It's awful.
Or think about big disasters. The material we looked at brings up that really jarring example of the 2011 tsunami in Japan. Some people actually interpreted it through this lens of, karmic payback. It just shows how fast we can jump to judgment, even demonization, instead of just acknowledging immense human suffering. So yeah, it happens personally, but it's also woven right into the cultural fabric in some really unsettling ways.
It's like we have this real aversion to just Sitting with the discomfort of someone else's pain,
Yep.
we feel this immediate need to dissect it, find a reason, debate it, anything but just be present with the reality of their hardship.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, if blame is this almost automatic thing, what's really driving it? What's at the root?
That's a huge question, and the material we've been digging into suggests that really at the heart of this fear of grief and why we blame is a fundamental fear of connection itself.
Fear of connection. How so?
It's like a reluctance to truly acknowledge our shared humanity, including the fact that suffering is part of that shared experience, something that protects us all, potentially.
That makes sense. Seeing someone else's pain is like looking in a mirror, reflecting our own potential for it.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of chips away at that illusion that we're somehow separate or immune.
Precisely. What starts as that natural empathy, that limbic brain connection, feeling what others feel, can quickly flip to a more basic brainstem survival thing.
Like us versus them.
Exactly, that fundamental division. We create distance. We put the suffering person on the other side of this invisible line because really letting their vulnerability in means we have to face our own.
And to feel safer, to feel like we have some control in what feels like a pretty chaotic world. We build up these elaborate systems. The material calls it magical thinking.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
The idea that if we just follow the rules, think positively, eat the right things, whatever, then we can somehow keep misfortune away. It's like carrying a lucky charm, isn't it? It makes you feel you have agency, even if logically.
Logically, it doesn't hold up, and the source material really hammers this home. Pain and grief often aren't seen as healthy, normal responses. They're seen as threats, as signs of failure somehow.
And this avoidance pops up in some unexpected places, like how we sometimes interpret faith.
Right. Let's get into that. The role of organized religion. Think about prayer. When someone's seriously ill, maybe they survive, and people say, oh, we're so blessed.
Yeah, you hear that a lot.
But the material points out that carries this unspoken flip side, doesn't it?
Meaning?
Well, if some people are blessed with a good outcome, what does that imply, even subtly, about those whose prayers maybe weren't answered in the way they hoped? It can accidentally create what Cheryl Strayed calls this false hierarchy of the blessed and the damned.
That idea of the vending machine God. Put in the right prayers, do the right things, and you expect a specific result.
Exactly. It gives that feeling of control again. But as the sources point out, it can also lead to a kind of spiritual cruelty almost, where people who are suffering are subtly judged as maybe less faithful or less deserving.
Which is ironic, because isn't the foundation of most faiths about love, compassion, being there for each other?
Absolutely. The core teachings usually emphasize companionship, not using faith to, game the system or judge others' suffering. But this avoidance of pain, it shows up outside religion, too, in these really powerful cultural stories we tell ourselves.
Like the cult of positivity. That relentless modern pressure to just be happy. Create your own reality. Happiness is an inside job.
Yeah.
It sounds good, right? But what's the downside?
Well, the sources we looked at really stress how this constant pressure can minimize real human suffering. It sends this unspoken message that feeling bad, sad, angry, grieving is a sign of weakness, like you failed to manage your inner world properly.
Yeah.
Drew West's words about being tired of insincere questions after her daughter died really hit hard here. That frustration with people just not being able to sit with the chaos and sometimes the sheer meaninglessness of loss.
And Barbara Ehrenreich's idea, the tyranny of positive thinking, is so spot on. Expecting someone with a serious illness to call it a gift, or telling them to suppress negative thoughts.
Right. And then, if they don't get better, the blame turns inward. I just wasn't positive enough.
It's brutal.
And what's really telling is how this forced positivity can shift focus away from bigger problems, systemic issues. If someone loses their job in a massive layoff,
Yeah.
and they're told, oh, this is an opportunity, just stay positive, it completely ignores the economic reality, doesn't it? It basically puts all the responsibility on the individual and silences their legitimate pain or anger.
It becomes a way to keep things as they are, almost. Like, historically, haven't ruling powers sometimes used mandated optimism, promise a great future to stop people complaining about the present?
That's a point raised in the material, yeah. So alongside this pressure to be positive all the time, there's also this thing called spiritual bypass. What's that about?
Right. So the idea is using your spiritual beliefs as a kind of detour around your actual feelings instead of dealing with them head on.
Yeah. Spiritual bypass, as the sources define it, is basically using spiritual ideas or practices to avoid facing difficult emotions, unresolved psychological stuff, basic emotional needs.
So it's that idea that if you're spiritual, You should somehow be above pain, untouched by worldly problems. You adopt this kind of non-attachment as a way to just sidestep anything difficult.
But the material we looked at really pushes back on that. It emphasizes that genuine spiritual practice isn't about wiping out pain or becoming some kind of emotionless robot. It's more about building the capacity to live with our pain, find connection within it, and actually grow more empathy.
It's that split between the head and the heart, isn't it?
Yeah.
Intellectualizing pain versus actually letting yourself feel it. The sources seem to suggest that real enlightenment, if you want to call it that, isn't about escaping pain. It's about being able to witness in yourself, in others, without needing to judge it or shut it down.
Yeah, that story from Monica Curlin about the Buddhist priest telling her that her intense grief was all in the mind. That really shows the potential harm of bypass. It just invalidates such a real, significant human experience.
So with all this avoidance, the blaming, the enforced positivity, the spiritual bypass, what are the actual costs? What happens when we consistently sidestep grief?
Well, personally, trying to constantly suppress pain just isn't sustainable. Unacknowledged grief doesn't just evaporate. It can morph into other things: addiction, anxiety, depression, pulling away from people. It can even feed into repeating harmful patterns like cycles of abuse.
And what about on a bigger scale, society-wide?
We risk becoming, well, numb to widespread suffering. We might distance ourselves from huge global issues, climate change, human rights crises, or when we do engage, maybe it's just with outrage and anger, not that deeper, more connecting grief.
Which leads to burnout.
Exactly. Burnout, less understanding between groups. Susan David nailed it, didn't she? Saying our whole cultural conversation is basically avoidant. She talks about this epidemic of unspoken grief.
Wow, an epidemic of unspoken grief. It feels like we've almost lost the knack for processing pain together, for just acknowledging it. So how do we start to change that? How do we build a culture where pain has a place instead of trying to erase it or explain it away?
The sources suggest we need to consciously make spaces where it's okay to be vulnerable. Whereas the poet Adrienne Rich said, weeping can still be counted as warriors. It means finding the courage to tell the truth about our pain without being afraid of judgment.
And accepting that sometimes. Things just hurt.
Yeah, accepting that hard, painful things happen, and maybe there isn't always a neat reason. The way forward seems to be in acknowledging that sometimes pain is just irredeemable, and then finding ways to stick together inside that hurt.
It really boils down to recognizing we're all in this together, doesn't it? That fear of loss makes us cling to these rigid ideas of right and wrong, but real strength, real survival comes from admitting we're all vulnerable.
Absolutely. When we're honest about our experiences, pain included, that's when real connection and empathy can actually happen. There was that great line from one of the teachers in the material: poignancy is kinship.
Poignancy is kinship. Explain that a bit.
That feeling of shared sorrow, of hurting with someone else, that feeling is the evidence of our connection. It shows we're related, that we belong to each other.
So if we start seeing pain not as a failure, but as a healthy, if difficult, response to loss.
Then we can shift that default reaction away from blame and avoidance and towards, well, love and grace. Real safety isn't found in pretending we're invincible. It's in having open hearts, being willing to feel the whole range of emotions together.
Acknowledgement.
Yeah.
Being seen and heard in our truth.
That's what the sources call the only real medicine of grief.
Okay, so wrapping this up, what we've really dug into today is how our culture tends to blame and avoid pain when life gets tough. It's a deep-seated habit, but ultimately it's pretty harmful, both for individuals and for all of us together.
Right. Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe something for you, our listener, to chew on. The next time you see someone in pain, just notice your first reaction. Is there a part of you that wants to find a reason, assign blame, offer some quick positivity? Yeah. And what might happen if instead you consciously chose to lean into connection, to just acknowledge what they're going through without judgment, to simply witness their reality? Think about how that small shift might change how you respond, not just to others' suffering, but to your own hard times too.